The courtroom was filled with a low hum of voices, the kind that rises when people are curious but trying to stay quiet. The air was heavy with tension, and every eye in the room turned toward the man standing by himself at the defendant's table. His clothes were worn out, his hair a little messy, and his face carried the tiredness of someone who had spent too many nights out in the cold. His name was Daniel Reed. To most people in that room, he looked like just another homeless man who had wandered into trouble. Daniel stood still, his hands clasped together, his head slightly bowed. He didn't look angry or defensive, just tired and uneasy. It was clear that being inside a courtroom again was not something he was used to anymore. On the other side of the room, a tall man in a dark gray suit leaned confidently on the prosecution table. His name was Richard Collins, a well-known lawyer who had built his career on winning, not on kindness. His watch gleamed under the lights, his shoes shone like mirrors, and the smug look on his face told everyone that he expected this case to be over in a few minutes. The case seemed simple. Daniel had been found sleeping in the lobby of a private building downtown. The building's security guard had called the police, and Daniel had been charged with trespassing. It wasn't a major crime, but still, he was required to appear in court. For Richard, this was just another easy win, another chance to show off his sharp tongue and superior confidence. As the judge entered, everyone stood. The room went silent. When the judge took his seat, he gave Daniel a long look before reading the case summary aloud. Mr. Daniel Reed, accused of trespassing in the building at 7th and Main Street. His voice was firm but not unkind. Then he turned to the lawyer. Mr. Collins, you may proceed. Richard straightened his tie, gave a little smirk, and walked toward the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, he began in a smooth, practiced tone, this is a straightforward matter. The defendant, Mr. Reed, was found sleeping in a private lobby, without permission, without any legitimate reason. The property manager had no choice but to call security. My client simply seeks justice for the disturbance caused by this intrusion. He paused, glancing toward Daniel with a faint smile that wasn't friendly. Now, I understand we live in a city with certain challenges, Richard continued, choosing his words like weapons. But that doesn't excuse breaking the law. Everyone here works hard, pays rent, follows rules. If we start allowing anyone to occupy private spaces just because they claim they have nowhere to go, where does it end? Order must be maintained. A few people in the room nodded. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Richard's words sounded polished, but his tone carried something else, something cruel. Then, as if he hadn't gone far enough, he added, and honestly, Your Honor, looking at the defendant, it's quite clear he's made a series of poor choices. Perhaps if he spent less time loitering and more time working, we wouldn't be here today. The words hit like small stones. Daniel didn't react, but his shoulders tensed. The room grew quieter. Even the clerk at the side of the bench shifted awkwardly. The judge gave Richard a sharp look. Mr. Collins, he said firmly, let's stick to the facts. Of course, Your Honor, Richard replied quickly, his smirk returning for just a second before fading. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he lifted his eyes slowly toward the judge. Your Honor, he said quietly, I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I just needed somewhere warm to rest for a few hours. It was raining that night and the shelter was full. I thought the lobby was empty. I didn't damage anything. I didn't mean to break any rules. His voice was calm and polite, almost too polite for a man being humiliated in public. There was something about the way he spoke, measured, clear, respectful, that caught a few people's attention. He didn't sound like most people imagined a homeless man would sound. There was a quiet strength in his tone, but also sadness. Richard chuckled under his breath, just loud enough for people to hear. I'm sure the lobby was just begging to be turned into a hotel room, he said mockingly. Your Honor, with all due respect, we hear these excuses all the time. Every trespasser has a story. The judge gave him a disapproving glance, but Richard went on. This is a simple matter. The law is the law. If we excuse this behavior, we open the door for chaos. What's next? People claiming emotional reasons for breaking into homes? No, we must draw the line. Daniel said nothing. He looked at the floor, his fingers rubbing nervously together. From the back row, a woman in a blue coat whispered to her friend, He doesn't look dangerous at all. Her friend nodded, watching with sympathy. Others seemed torn, half believing Richard's words, half feeling sorry for the man standing alone in front of them. The judge leaned back, studying Daniel for a moment. Mr. Reed, he said, do you have a lawyer? Daniel shook his head. No, Your Honor, I can't afford one. Richard turned slightly, pretending to whisper, but loud enough for people to hear. Of course he can't, he said with a half smile. A few chuckles escaped from the audience, but they were quickly silenced by the judge's sharp gaze. Daniel stayed quiet. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't argue or shout. There was something in his calm that made Richard even more irritated. The judge sighed softly. Very well. Since this is a minor offense, I'll allow you to speak on your own behalf. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the court before I make a decision? Daniel hesitated. For a moment it looked like he might say no. His lips parted, then closed again. His eyes wandered across the courtroom, the flag behind the judge's bench, the worn wooden seats, the tired faces staring back at him. Then his gaze stopped on Richard, who was already gathering his papers, confident the hearing was over. Something inside Daniel shifted. He stood a little straighter and took a deep breath. Your Honor, he said slowly, I would like to say something, but I don't want to waste anyone's time. I just think maybe there's more to this than what it looks like. The judge nodded, signaling him to continue. I wasn't always like this, Daniel went on. His voice was steady now, but low. I used to have a job. A good one. I used to wear a suit too, just like Mr. Collins over there. He paused, glancing at Richard. The lawyer's confident expression flickered just slightly. I worked in law for almost 20 years. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. The courtroom grew still. Even Richard for once stopped tapping his pen. I lost my wife in an accident 5 years ago, Daniel continued softly. My daughter too. After that, I couldn't focus. I lost my job, lost my home. I tried to start over, but it didn't work out. So yes, I was sleeping in that lobby. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted a few hours of warmth. A murmur passed through the audience. The judge's expression changed. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking as if he wanted to interrupt but didn't know how. Daniel didn't look for pity. He just told his story, one plain sentence at a time. I know what I look like now, he said, but I'm still human. I still remember the law, the rules, the way things should be. I understand Mr. Collins is just doing his job. I just wish he could see that sometimes people aren't criminals, they're just lost. When Daniel stopped speaking, silence filled the room. Even the faint hum of the ceiling fan sounded louder. The judge took off his glasses, rubbed his forehead, and looked at Richard. Mr. Collins, he said quietly, do you have any response? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. For once, the man known for his confidence had nothing clever to say. The courtroom sat in that silence for a long moment before the judge spoke again. Thank you, Mr. Reed, he said gently. I'll take your statement into consideration. Daniel nodded. He looked down again, but this time his shoulders didn't slump as low. There was a quiet strength in the way he stood, like a man who, despite losing almost everything, still carried his dignity. As the judge moved on to the next case, a strange stillness lingered in the air. People whispered softly to each other, not sure what to feel. The lawyer, who had entered the courtroom full of pride, now looked uneasy. The man who had walked in humiliated had, in just a few minutes, earned everyone's quiet respect. And though the hearing wasn't over yet, something had already changed in that room. No one knew that what was about to be revealed in the next few moments would leave the entire courtroom speechless. The courtroom was still quiet after Daniel's words. You could almost feel the air change, like everyone had suddenly remembered that the man standing there wasn't just another case file or statistic. He was a person, but Richard Collins didn't want to admit it. His pride wouldn't let him. He'd built his career on being the smartest, sharpest man in every room. And now this homeless man, the very person he had mocked, had managed to silence him without even trying. Richard shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. He picked up a few papers just to look busy, though he wasn't really reading them. The judge was writing notes and Daniel stood quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. No one spoke for a few seconds, but the silence was heavy. Finally, Richard broke it. Your Honor, he said, his voice slightly tighter than before. While the defendant's story is tragic, we can't allow emotions to cloud the facts. The law must remain fair and consistent. If we excuse one act of trespassing, what message does that send? He tried to sound confident, but there was something forced about it now. The smooth tone he used earlier was gone. People could hear the hesitation. The judge looked up slowly. "Mr. Collins," he said, "I understand your point, but compassion and justice are not opposites." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't used to being corrected in front of a full courtroom. He could feel a faint heat creeping up his neck. He forced a smile and stepped back to his table. Daniel stayed still. He didn't look angry or proud, just calm. The judge turned to him again. "Mr. Reed, do you have any documents or witnesses to support your statement?" Daniel shook his head. "No, Your Honor, I don't have anything." "Just my word," the judge nodded thoughtfully. He glanced at the file again, then back at Daniel. "Very well. I'll need a few minutes to review before I give a decision." As the judge stepped away to his chambers, the courtroom relaxed a little. People whispered softly among themselves. Some of them were talking about Daniel's story. Others were murmuring about the lawyer's arrogance. Even the bailiff, who rarely showed emotion, seemed to be frowning slightly at Richard. Richard leaned against his table, pretending to review his notes, but he could feel the stares. He hated it. He wasn't used to being the one people judged. Usually he was the man in control, confident, polished, untouchable. But something about the way Daniel had spoken had unsettled him. There was truth in that man's voice, something pure that no argument could twist. Across the room, Daniel sat down slowly on the wooden bench, folding his hands together. He looked tired, but not defeated. There was a strange peace on his face, like he'd already accepted whatever would happen next. For him, it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about being heard, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A young man sitting in the back row leaned toward his friend. "That homeless guy, did you hear how he talked? He sounded like he actually knows the law." His friend nodded. "Yeah, like a teacher or something. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't far from the truth." When the judge returned, everyone stood. The room fell silent again. The judge cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the details of this case," he said. "I've also considered Mr. Reed's explanation and the nature of the charge. Mr. Collins, do you have any closing remarks before I make my decision?" Richard took a deep breath. He couldn't back down now, not after coming this far. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, stepping forward. "While I understand the defendant's circumstances, we must remember that laws exist for a reason. If everyone who faced hardship ignored them, society would fall apart. This isn't about sympathy. It's about accountability." He paused for effect, then turned slightly toward Daniel. "And with all due respect, Mr. Reed, we all face challenges. Some rise above them and some choose not to." That last line felt cruel even to people who didn't know Daniel. The room grew uncomfortably still. A few heads turned away. One woman in the gallery whispered, "That was unnecessary." Another person sighed softly, but Richard didn't stop. "Your Honor, we can't treat this case differently because it makes us feel emotional. The defendant broke the law, plain and simple." He looked around the room expecting to see agreement, but instead he saw disappointment. It was subtle, but he could feel it. The judge's expression didn't change, but there was something colder in his eyes now. "Thank you, Mr. Collins," the judge said curtly. "You've made your point." Richard stepped back, feeling uneasy. The words he had just said were his usual courtroom strategy, but this time they didn't feel like a victory. They felt hollow. The judge turned to Daniel. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I'll give you one last opportunity to respond if you wish." Daniel stood up slowly. "I don't have much to say, Your Honor," he began softly, "but I do want to make one thing clear." He looked straight at Richard, not with anger, but with a calm, steady gaze. "I didn't choose to be homeless. Nobody does. Life doesn't ask for permission before it breaks you, but even now I still respect the law. I came here today because I believe in it." He paused for a moment. "I also believe people can forget what real justice means. It's not just punishment. Sometimes it's understanding." The judge leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Around the room, people nodded slightly, touched by the sincerity in Daniel's words. Even Richard, though he didn't want to admit it, felt a strange tightness in his chest. He looked away, pretending to adjust his tie. The judge sighed quietly. "Mr. Reed, thank you," he said. "I can see that you have respect for the system. That counts for something." He looked down at the case file again, flipping through a few pages. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. He turned to Daniel. "Mr. Reed, earlier you mentioned you worked in law. Could you clarify that for the record?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I used to teach law. I was a professor for about 15 years. The judge blinked. A quiet gasp ran through the courtroom. Even Richard looked up, startled. You taught law? The judge asked, clearly surprised. Yes, Daniel replied. At the state university. I taught criminal justice and ethics. Now the whispers began. Quiet, disbelieving voices spreading through the audience. A few people looked at Richard. He was frozen, his mind racing. The name, the voice. Something about this man was suddenly familiar. But it couldn't be, could it? The judge frowned. Mr. Reed, your name sounds familiar. Did you ever publish papers on legal integrity? Daniel gave a small, tired smile. A few, yes. A long time ago. The judge leaned back, astonished. Well, I'll be, he said softly. I've read some of your work. The room buzzed with murmurs again. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. The man who had just been mocked for being homeless was once a respected law professor. And then, like a light turning on, Richard finally remembered. His heart sank. Years ago, when he was just starting law school, there had been a guest lecturer, a kind, brilliant man who had spoken about the importance of humility and empathy in practicing law. That man's name had been Daniel Reed. Richard felt his throat tighten. He looked at Daniel, and suddenly all the pieces fell into place, and the calm voice, the way he spoke about justice, the reason his words carried so much weight. It was him, the man he had once looked up to, the man whose lectures had inspired him to become a lawyer in the first place, and now he had just humiliated him. Richard's stomach turned. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but his voice wouldn't come out. He just stood there, staring, while Daniel quietly looked back, saying nothing. The judge noticed the tension but said nothing for the moment. He simply tapped his pen against the desk and said, I think this court needs a short recess. Everyone stood as the judge exited. The room erupted into quiet conversation. People looked at Daniel with new respect. The same man who had been judged moments ago was now being seen for who he truly was. But for Richard, it wasn't respect that filled his heart. It was shame. He sank into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever been. Daniel sat quietly again, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry, but there was sadness in his eyes, the kind that comes from seeing the best and worst of people. And as the courtroom whispered and shifted around them, one thing had become clear to everyone watching. This case wasn't just about trespassing anymore. It was about pride, compassion, and the kind of truth that makes even the most powerful man stop and think. What was about to happen next would change everything, not just for Daniel, but for Richard too. Because sometimes the people we judge the harshest are the very ones who once taught us what it means to be human. The courtroom was silent when the judge announced a short break. People stood up, but no one hurried to leave. They just kept looking at Daniel, whispering softly to each other, still processing what they had just heard. The homeless man they had pitied moments ago was once a respected law professor. It was hard to believe, yet something about his calm manner and the way he spoke made it clear. He was telling the truth. Richard sat at his table, staring blankly ahead. His usually confident expression was gone. He looked pale, his jaw tight, his mind spinning. He couldn't stop thinking about the past, about those lectures from years ago when he was a nervous law student sitting in a big classroom, trying to make sense of all the complicated words and ideas. He remembered the man who had made it simple, who had explained that law wasn't just about winning. It was about doing what was right. That man was Daniel Reed, and now, that same man was sitting across from him, worn down by life, with eyes that carried more pain than Richard could ever imagine. When the judge stepped out, Richard stayed seated, gripping the edge of the table. A few people around him whispered, their voices low but full of judgment. That lawyer mocked his own teacher, one person said quietly. Another replied, Karma has a funny way of showing up, doesn't it? Richard heard them. Every word cut deeper than the last. He wanted to stand up, to walk over to Daniel and apologize, but he didn't know how. He didn't even know if he should. Would it make things worse? Would Daniel even want to hear from him? Across the room, Daniel sat quietly, his eyes on the floor. He wasn't angry. In fact, there was something almost peaceful about his expression. But there was sadness too. The kind of sadness that comes from remembering a life you used to have. He had seen many people look at him with pity before, but this moment was different. He wasn't ashamed anymore. For once, people were seeing him not as a problem, but as a person. After a few minutes, the judge returned and everyone took their seats again. The courtroom fell silent. The judge looked serious but calm. He picked up the file again, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I've reviewed your record and what you've told us today. I also looked into your past briefly. It appears everything you said checks out. You were indeed a professor of law at the university for several years." A quiet gasp ran through the audience again, even though most already believed it. The judge continued, "I must admit I was surprised to see your name. I read your work when I was still in law school. You wrote a paper about compassion and fairness in criminal justice. I remember it clearly because it changed the way I thought about sentencing." Daniel gave a faint smile. "Thank you, Your Honor, that means a lot." Richard looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His heart was pounding. The judge's words only deepened his guilt. The very man he had ridiculed was someone who had helped shape not only his own career but many others. The judge turned his attention to Richard. "Mr. Collins," he said, "did you know about this before the hearing?" Richard swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," he admitted. I didn't recognize him until now." The judge raised an eyebrow. "I see. And now that you do you have anything you wish to say?" The question caught him off guard. For the first time in his career, Richard had no prepared speech, no clever response, no strategy. He took a deep breath and stood up slowly. His voice wasn't smooth this time. It was uncertain, shaky, Your Honor. I want to apologize," he began. He turned toward Daniel. "Not just to the court, but to Mr. Reed. I didn't treat him with respect. I judged him before I even listened. I spoke cruelly and I was wrong." The room went completely silent. Even the sound of papers rustling stopped. Richard continued, his voice low but sincere. "Mr. Reed, you once taught me, though you probably don't remember, that a lawyer's first duty is to seek truth, not victory. I forgot that. I became so focused on winning that I stopped seeing the people behind the cases. Today you reminded me of what I lost." Daniel looked up, his eyes soft. He didn't speak, but there was no anger in his expression. The judge nodded slowly. "That's a good start, Mr. Collins," he said. "But actions speak louder than words. We'll come to that later. For now, I'd like to continue with this case." He turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Reed, the charge against you is trespassing. However, given your circumstances and your explanation, I see no criminal intent. I also believe punishment won't serve any purpose here. Instead, I'd like to discuss how we can help you get back on your feet." Daniel blinked, surprised. "Your Honor, I didn't come here for help. I just wanted to clear things up." The judge gave a small smile. "Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about rebuilding." He looked at the bailiff. "Please connect Mr. Reed with the city's housing and rehabilitation program. Let's make sure he gets proper assistance." The bailiff nodded. The audience murmured softly, touched by the judge's decision. It wasn't something they saw every day. Richard stood there, still processing everything. He had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win. Another line on his record. Another small case to close quickly. Instead, he had been humbled in front of everyone. But strangely, he didn't feel angry. He felt relieved. For the first time in years, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't playing a role. He was just a man realizing how far he had drifted from who he wanted to be. As the hearing wrapped up, the judge tapped his pen on the desk. "Case dismissed," he said. "Mr. Reed, I hope you accept our help. And Mr. Collins?" He paused, looking directly at the lawyer. "Remember this day? Let it make you a better man." Richard nodded slowly. "I will, Your Honor." The judge stood and the bailiff announced the end of the session. People started to leave, but no one spoke loudly. It was as if everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something, deeper than just a legal case, and something that touched their hearts. Daniel gathered his few belongings, a small notebook and an old coat, and started to leave. Before he reached the door, he felt a presence behind him. He turned around and saw Richard standing there, looking unsure. "Mr. Reed," Richard began quietly, "I don't know if you can forgive me. I was cruel and I can't take that back. But I want to make things right. Please let me help." Daniel studied him for a moment. His eyes weren't angry, just thoughtful. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "We all lose ourselves sometimes. The important thing is finding our way back." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "Maybe I lost more than I realized." If you'll let me, I'd like to help you. Maybe get you connected with the right people, get you a place to stay. Daniel smiled faintly. That's kind of you. But you don't need to do it for me. Do it for yourself. The words hit Richard harder than any lecture ever could. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel extended his hand. Richard hesitated, not because he didn't want to shake it, but because he didn't feel worthy. Still, he reached out and took Daniel's hand. It was firm but gentle, the handshake of two men who understood each other in a way words couldn't express. As Daniel turned to leave, the lawyer stood there watching him. Outside the courthouse windows, the afternoon sun poured in, casting a soft light across the room. The whole place felt different now, quieter, humbler, almost peaceful. When Richard finally stepped outside, he saw Daniel sitting on a bench near the steps, looking at the sky. For the first time in a long while, Richard didn't feel superior or powerful. He just felt human. He sat beside him not as a lawyer, but as a man who had learned something important that day. You know, Richard said softly, you once told a class full of students that success without kindness is failure. I didn't understand it back then, but I do now, Daniel smiled. I'm glad you remember. They sat in silence for a moment, the city moving around them, cars passing, people walking, life continuing. It was a simple scene, but something about it felt meaningful. Two men from different worlds sharing a quiet moment of understanding. After a while, Daniel stood up. Take care of yourself, Richard, he said. You too, Richard replied. And thank you. Daniel gave a small nod and walked away slowly, blending into the crowd. Richard watched him go, his heart heavy but hopeful. That day he didn't just lose a case. He found something far more valuable. A reminder of humility, of respect, of what it truly means to serve justice. And as he turned to leave, Richard knew this was not the end of their story. Something deep inside told him their paths would cross again, but next time it wouldn't be in a courtroom. It would be as two men who understood each other, not as a winner and a loser, but as equals. A few days had passed since that unforgettable day in court, but the moment kept replaying in Richard's mind over and over. No matter what he did, he couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. The image of him standing there, calm and dignified even after being humiliated, had left a deep mark on his heart. For the first time in years, Richard felt ashamed, not because he lost a case, but because he realized how far he had drifted from the kind of person he once wanted to be. At his office, things looked the same as always. The large desk, the expensive chair, the wall full of awards, everything screamed success. But for Richard, those things no longer felt the same. He sat there staring at his reflection in the shiny surface of his desk, feeling a strange emptiness. His assistant knocked gently on the door. Sir, you have a meeting with a new client in 10 minutes, she said. Cancel it, Richard replied softly. She looked surprised. All of them, sir? He nodded. Yes, all of them. For today. When she left, Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about the day he first decided to become a lawyer. He remembered how passionate he once was about helping people, about fighting for fairness. But somewhere along the way, he had started chasing money and recognition instead. He had become cold, arrogant, and distant, the very opposite of what his old mentor Daniel Reed had taught him to be. He couldn't just move on. He had to do something. He picked up his phone and searched the city's housing assistance program. After a few calls and some persistence, he managed to find where Daniel had been referred after the court hearing. It was a small rehabilitation center on the quiet side of town, a place that helped people find jobs, housing, and mental health support. The next morning, Richard decided to visit. When he arrived, the building looked humble but clean. There was a garden in front with a few benches and a small group of people talking quietly. He went inside and spoke to the receptionist. Excuse me, he said. I'm looking for Daniel Reed. I believe he was admitted here recently. The woman at the desk smiled kindly. Oh yes, Mr. Reed. He's been helping out in the library. He's quite popular already. Richard raised an eyebrow. Helping out? She nodded. Yes, he volunteers here now. He spends hours reading with some of the younger people. He says it keeps his mind busy. Richard felt a small smile tug at his lips. Even after everything, Daniel was still giving back. When he entered the small library, he saw him right away. Daniel was sitting at a table surrounded by a few young men and women. explaining something from an old law book. His voice was calm and patient, the same as it had been years ago when he stood in front of his students. For a moment, Richard just stood there watching, remembering the same gentle tone that had once inspired him. After a few minutes, Daniel noticed him. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a small, warm smile. "Well," he said softly, standing up. "I didn't expect to see you here." Richard smiled awkwardly. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me." Daniel gestured toward a chair. "You're here now. That says enough. Please sit." They sat across from each other at the same table where Daniel had been teaching moments ago. The younger people quietly left, sensing that the two men needed to talk alone. "I didn't come to disturb you," Richard said. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened." Daniel nodded slowly. "It was quite a day." "Yes," Richard said, taking a deep breath. "A day that changed me more than I expected. I realized how wrong I've been. I became the kind of lawyer who wins cases but loses his heart in the process. I forgot the human side of what we do." "You reminded me of that." Daniel listened quietly. His eyes were gentle but filled with wisdom. "You're not the only one," he said. "It happens to many people. Life moves fast, and success can make us forget why we started. The important thing is recognizing it and doing something about it." Richard leaned forward slightly. "That's what I want to do. I want to help. Not just you, others too. I want to use what I have to make a difference." Daniel smiled faintly. "Then you've already started changing." There was a short pause between them, not awkward, just peaceful. Richard looked around the small library. There were only a few shelves filled with donated books. The tables were old and the chairs were mismatched. Yet there was warmth in the air, a feeling that people here cared for each other. "Do you need anything here?" Richard asked suddenly. "Books, supplies, furniture, and anything at all?" Daniel chuckled softly. "We always need things, but I'm not sure this place can afford your kind of generosity." "I'm not offering it as charity," Richard said quickly. "I'm offering it as gratitude." Daniel looked thoughtful. "Gratitude, huh?" He smiled again, that calm, knowing smile. "All right then. If you really want to help, maybe you can sponsor some of the people here who are trying to rebuild their lives. Most of them just need a small push, a job, a place to stay, a bit of hope." Richard nodded. "Consider it done." They talked for a long time after that, about life, choices, the way people lose themselves and sometimes find their way back. Richard listened more than he spoke. It felt strange but good, like reconnecting with something real after years of noise and pride. Before leaving, Richard said softly, "You know, I still remember your lecture about compassion. You once said, 'The law is a mirror. It reflects who we are as a society.' I didn't understand it then. Now I do," Daniel smiled. "That lecture feels like a lifetime ago, but I'm glad you remember it." When Richard stood up to go, he hesitated. "Would it be all right if I visited again?" Daniel looked genuinely pleased. "Of course. Just make sure you bring that humility with you next time," he said jokingly. Richard laughed quietly. "I'll try my best." As he walked out of the center, Richard felt lighter. For the first time in a long while, his mind wasn't filled with numbers or case strategies. It was filled with purpose. He looked at the people outside, ordinary men and women trying to rebuild their lives. And for the first time, he didn't see them as statistics or clients. He saw them as human beings. The following week, Richard kept his word. He arranged for new books and learning materials for the center. He also started a small scholarship fund for anyone in the program who wanted to study law or social work. He didn't tell anyone publicly. No press, no announcements. Just quiet action. When he visited again, Daniel was sitting in the same spot in the library, reading a book. He looked up and smiled. "You're back," Richard nodded. "I said I would be." They talked again, sometimes about the past, sometimes about the future. Slowly, a bond formed between them. Not of teacher and student, but of equals, two men who had learned different lessons from the same life. One afternoon, as they were walking in the garden behind the center, Richard said, "You could go back to teaching, you know. People would be lucky to learn from you again." Daniel looked at the sky, his eyes distant but calm. "Maybe someday," he said. "For now, I just want to help people right here. These are my students now, not in a classroom, but in life." Richard smiled. "That's probably the best kind of teaching there is. They both stood in silence for a while, watching the sunset. The golden light made the whole place glow softly, as if time itself had slowed down. For Richard, this wasn't just redemption, it was renewal. And for Daniel, it was peace. When they said goodbye that day, Richard promised to return again soon. But as he walked back to his car, he felt a deep sense of clarity. He knew that the experience had changed him forever. He didn't need trophies or fame anymore. He needed meaning, and he had finally found it again. That night when he got home, he sat at his desk and opened an old notebook he hadn't touched in years. Inside were his notes from Daniel's lectures. The handwriting was messy, but one line stood out. A lawyer's power lies not in his words, but in his heart. He read that line over and over until his eyes grew wet. Then he closed the notebook and whispered to himself, "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." And somewhere at that same moment, in a small room at the rehabilitation center, Daniel was sitting by the window, watching the city lights and smiling faintly. Maybe he didn't have much anymore. No house, no car, no wealth. But he had his dignity, his wisdom, and now something even more valuable: the knowledge that he had made someone remember what it truly means to be human. Several months passed after that first visit to the rehabilitation center, and a lot had changed, not only for Richard, but for Daniel and the people around them too. The small center that once struggled to stay open was now buzzing with new life. Thanks to the quiet help that came from Richard, they had new books, proper furniture, and even a small computer room where people could learn basic skills and apply for jobs. But Richard didn't just send money or supplies. He came himself, and week after week, he sat with people, listened to their stories, and sometimes even helped them write resumes or prepare for interviews. For a man who once only dealt with the rich and powerful, it was a completely different world. Yet somehow he felt more at home there than anywhere else. Each time he visited, Daniel greeted him with the same calm smile, offering him tea in a small paper cup. They would sit together under the tree near the garden, talking for hours. Sometimes they discussed the law, sometimes just life. Daniel never lectured him, never made him feel guilty for the past. Instead, he guided him quietly, the way a wise friend does, with patience and kindness. One afternoon, while they were sitting together, Richard noticed that Daniel looked tired. His face seemed pale and his hands trembled slightly as he poured the tea. "Are you all right?" Richard asked with concern. Daniel smiled faintly. "Just a little tired today. Nothing serious, but Richard could tell something was wrong." The next day, he returned earlier than usual and spoke to one of the staff members. "Is Daniel okay? He looked unwell yesterday." The woman sighed softly. "He's been having some health problems lately. The doctors are checking him, but he doesn't want anyone to worry." Richard's chest tightened. He went straight to the library where Daniel was helping a young man fill out a form. After waiting patiently, he said, "You should be resting." Daniel chuckled. "And let all this paperwork pile up?" "Not a chance," Richard shook his head. "I mean it. You've done enough. Let others take over for a while." Daniel looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, I used to think the same way, and that rest meant stopping. But sometimes doing what gives you meaning is rest. Helping others keeps me alive inside." Richard didn't argue. He just nodded, knowing Daniel was right in his own quiet way. Over the next few weeks, Richard spent even more time at the center. He started teaching small workshops, simple ones about basic legal rights and how people could protect themselves from being taken advantage of. The first time he stood in front of that small crowd, he felt nervous. Not because of the topic, but because this time, the audience wasn't made up of clients or businessmen. They were ordinary people trying to rebuild their lives just like Daniel once had. He spoke from the heart. "The law should protect you, not scare you," he said. "And no one, no matter their situation, should ever feel less human because of where they are in life." When he finished, the room went quiet for a moment. Then one by one people started clapping, not loudly, not dramatically, but warmly, sincerely. And when Richard looked at Daniel sitting in the front row, he saw pride in his old mentor's eyes. That moment meant more to him than any trophy he had ever received. But time has a way of moving quietly, even when everything feels perfect. One chilly morning, Richard arrived at the center with a box of new books, smiling as usual. But as soon as he walked in, he noticed something different. The air felt heavy, the usual chatter was missing, and a few people were sitting quietly in the corner. He saw the receptionist, her eyes red from crying. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. She looked up and whispered, "It's Daniel. He passed away early this morning." For a moment, the world went completely silent. Richard felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He just stood there, staring at nothing. Later, he went to the small room where Daniel had been staying. It was simple. Just a bed, a small desk, and a few books neatly stacked beside it. On the desk was a letter with his name written on it. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, in Daniel's familiar handwriting, were a few short lines. "My dear friend, if you're reading this, it means I've finally gone where all journeys end. Don't be sad. My time here was full of purpose again, and you were part of that. I saw in you what I always believed the law should create: compassion. Don't let it fade. Keep helping others. That's the legacy worth leaving. With peace and gratitude, Daniel." Tears rolled down Richard's face as he read those words. He sat down on the bed, holding the letter close to his chest. For the first time in years, he cried openly, not out of regret, but out of love and respect. A few days later, the center held a small memorial for Daniel. There were no grand speeches or formal ceremonies, just people sharing stories about how he had touched their lives. Some talked about how he helped them find jobs, others about how he taught them to read, and a few simply said that he made them feel human again. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, his voice trembling at first. "Daniel wasn't just a teacher," he said softly. "He was a mirror that showed people who they truly could be. He taught me something I'll never forget: that dignity doesn't come from money, success, or status. It comes from how we treat others. I once humiliated him in court, and yet he chose to forgive me and teach me again, not through words, but through kindness. I'll carry that lesson for the rest of my life." After the memorial, Richard made a decision. He wanted Daniel's work to continue, not as charity, but as a living tribute. Within months, he set up a foundation in Daniel's name, the Reed Foundation for Human Dignity. It focused on helping homeless individuals, former prisoners, and people struggling to rebuild their lives get access to legal aid, education, and housing. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't invite the media or announce it in newspapers. But word spread naturally, and soon, lawyers from different cities began volunteering their time. The foundation grew slowly but steadily, and every time someone got their life back on track, Richard felt that Daniel's spirit was right there, smiling quietly. Years later, Richard was invited to speak at a national law conference. As he stood on stage, he looked out at hundreds of young lawyers, all eager to make their mark. He took a deep breath and said, "When I first started in this field, I thought winning was everything. But I was wrong. True success in law and in life isn't about winning cases. It's about defending humanity. Never forget that the person standing across from you in court is still a person, with a story, with pain, with dreams. Never let arrogance blind your compassion." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Some wiped away tears. Others nodded slowly, understanding the truth behind his voice. After the speech, a young woman approached him and said, "Sir, your words changed the way I see this profession." "I want to work for your foundation," Richard smiled warmly. "You're welcome anytime. Just remember, help people but never pity them. Respect is the best gift you can give." As he left the conference hall that evening, the sunset painted the sky with golden light, the same color he remembered from that garden at the center. He stopped for a moment, looking up, feeling a calm presence around him. "Thank you, Daniel," he whispered quietly. "You're still teaching me." He smiled to himself and walked away, the letter still folded carefully in his wallet, a reminder of where he had been, what he had learned, and who had helped him find his way back. And though Daniel was gone, his legacy lived on, not in stone, not in buildings, but in the lives he had touched, and in the heart of a man who once lost his way but found redemption through kindness. Sometimes, the people we think have nothing are the ones who have everything that truly matters. Daniel had no wealth, no house, no luxury. Yet he had the power to change hearts, heal wounds, and leave behind something greater than success: humanity. And Richard, once known for his pride and arrogance, became known for something far more valuable: compassion. People admired him not for the number of cases he won, but for the number of lives he changed. Years later, whenever someone at the foundation asked him why he started it all, he would simply smile and say, "Because one man once reminded me that everyone deserves a little dignity." And that was the truth that left everyone speechless. Not the courtroom moment, not the confrontation, but the quiet transformation of a heart that learned what it really means to be human.